you want to hold a piece of history in your hand, I've got that too. I'm serious. Part of the Berlin Wall.
Oh my gosh.
I've traveled overseas to Germany quite a bit, and friends of mine have been kind enough to let me have parts of it. So if you get an idea what it looks like, this fell, of course, the wall fell in 1990. Basically, it was started in 1989. But that's what the part looked like. And
where is it in Missouri that that they actually have some of the?
I'm not sure about what it is.
My husband and I
know there are
had
parts
been
of
there.
in
Yeah,
Europe
I can't remember the name of the town, but
yeah.
I mean, they have several panels.
Oh yeah, I'm sure they do.
Yeah,
I've got a place in Europe that's had the same thing.
To go.
So I know it was parceled out, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I've had friends of mine who were masons, brick masons, who said that was a very poor job of putting that thing together. But when trying to break it down, they said it was very hard. What I was told. Okay. All right, the Berlin Blockade in the airlift represented the first major international crisis of the Cold War. During the multinational occupation of post-World War II Germany, the Soviet Union blocked the Western Allies' railway, road, and canal access into West Berlin under Western control. There were several countries involved in this effort to supply a blockade Berlin, but my remarks will be directed toward the United States and Great Britain because they provided the greatest bulk of the aircraft and delivered the greatest supply tonnage to West Berlin during the 14 months of this operation. Now, of course, it says May 12, 1949 is when it ended, but it continued up to September 30th, 1949 to make sure the Berliners had enough supplies should the Russians reimpose their blockade, they could survive. Okay? So, anyway, we'll get right to that. This is what it looked like. C-54 Skymaster flying into Tempelhof Airport with Berliners looking, watching it land. Now let's look at the personalities involved. Joseph Stalin, the premier of the Soviet Union, the absolute master of the country. He was nothing but a paranoid, bloodthirsty, power-hungry tyrant with the blood of millions on his hands, resulting from the blood purges of the 1930s. General Curtis E. LeMay, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Air Forces in Western Europe, a proven battle leader. He eventually became Chief of Staff of the Air Force in 1961, and his tenure lasted until 1965. General Lucius D. Clay, U.S. Army. He was the military commander of the American occupation zone in West Germany. I have more to say about him later on. The origins of the Berlin Blockade had its beginnings in the same conference that decided on the partitioning of Germany in 1945. This was the Yalta Conference that lasted from February 12th to the 15th of 1945. And originally there were only 3 occupation zones envisaged, but the French lobbied for so strongly for their own zone that the United States and Great Britain allowed them to take off part of their occupation zone to form their own occupation zone. But as you can see, France had no border with the Russian zone. And therefore, when it came to doing anything with this, they had to operate from the British sector. What they'll say about the French, they could do nothing more for this operation than supply their own troops stationed in Berlin. Because at the same time this is going on, they were fighting a war with Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, which lasted until 1954 with the fall of Dien Bien Phu, and the French were forced to leave Vietnam, and then we began to gradually get involved. And you know where all that went. But anyways, you can see in this map the location of Berlin. It's 110 miles inside the Russian-occupied zone of Germany. They control access to it. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And Berlin itself was also divided basically along the same lines as the country. Red you see are Russian, blue French, green British, gold United States. Now let's look at the policy that the Soviets used to control access to Berlin. They required no more than 10 cargo trains per day allowed into Berlin by sector. Since the British and American had control, well, had border with the country itself, and France didn't, they could still have a cargo, or have 10 cargo trains per day per sector brought into the city on one track. They also required that there were only 3 air corridors for access to Berlin: Hamburg for the British, Brüggeburg for the French, and then Frankfurt am Main for the American. This agreement was signed in November 1945, which the Russians had to respect, because had they not respected, it could lead to war. Aircraft could fly no higher than 3,000 meters once entered in the air corridor. That is to say, no more than 9,880 feet. Any height beyond that invited Soviet interceptor aircraft that would confront the airplane and shoot it down. Now let's take a look at those corridors. As you can see, there are three of them. Obviously, Hamburg for the British, Luxembourg for the French, and Frankfurt for the American. Each of these corridors was 20 miles wide, flying into the following airports. Tegel for the French, which we also used during this airlift operation for a while. It's still open today. It's been expanded, greatly so. And British landing at the Gatto Airport, which is now a military museum. And then Tempelhof for the Americans, which has been closed for several years. Now, the events that led up to this blockade in Berlin, airlift. Since there was no formal agreement with the Russians to guarantee rail or road access to Berlin, we had to rely upon Soviet goodwill. Now think about that, how far that might go. Well, so in 1940, well, one other thing I wanted to say about this is that in this conference with the Yalta in 1945, President Truman had a conversation with Joseph Stalin, had mentioned the fact that he wasn't sure whether or not the United States would stay inside Germany once the country would be reunified in 1949 by setting up a German government to govern the entire country, at which point all the Allied occupation powers would withdraw. Well, the war ended in May of 1945, and by June, Stalin was already telling his people in East Berlin and East Germany that he was going to force the Western Allies out of Berlin slowly by using disruption tactics and travel restrictions. He believed that once the Allies were confronted with a land blockade of the city itself, that they could not afford to fly into the city because they couldn't afford it, and they didn't have enough aircraft to do the job. So he felt that the only option they had would be to evacuate the city itself so he could take it over, and eventually his goal was to set up a communist dictatorship inside Germany itself. Well, Vyacheslav Molotov, his foreign minister, made this comment publicly. He said, whatever happens to Berlin happens to Germany. Whatever happens to Germany happens to Europe, which was basically saying what Stalin already was thinking about. He not only wanted to set up a communist dictatorship in Germany, but he wanted to force all the Western European countries, Western European countries, into becoming vassal states or slave states for the Soviet Union, much as what he had done with the Eastern European countries occupied by the Red Army during World War II. He wanted the entire continent under his control. That was his goal. Anyway, what you're going to see now is a quid pro quo situation that led up to the blockade and airlift. In other words, tit for tat. You do this, we do that. The Soviets stopped delivering agricultural goods to both Berlin itself as well as the Western occupied sectors of zones of Germany. General Lucius Clay countered by stopping shipments of dismantled industries from Western Germany to the Soviets, which hurt the Russians greatly because they, by their reparations agreement with the West, they wanted dismantled factories sent from Western Germany to their country to help rebuild it, which had suffered greatly during World War II. The German occupation occupied basically a third of Russia itself. And once the Russians began to reoccupy or regain their territory occupied by the Germans instituted a policy of scorched earth. So as they were forced to retreat, they destroyed everything that could be used by the Soviets. That included bridges, dams, waterworks, electrical works, anything that could be used to sustain life. They wanted to destroy it or dismantle or non-functional by the time they left, which left them very devastated, you can imagine. At any rate, that's what they wanted, was these dismantled factories from the West to try to help rebuild their country. So what's the deal with them? Well, stalled all of a sudden. The idea?
New battery.
I text.
Come on.
Not me.
Okay.
Until I get the battery.
All right, thank you. Okay, continue. April 1st, 1948, the Soviets issued orders restricting Western military passenger traffic between the American, British, and French zones of occupation in Berlin. Now this affected the entire country, not just Berlin. Soviets announced that no cargo would leave Berlin by rail without permission of Soviet authorities, and each train and truck was researched by the same authorities. April 2nd, here's what General Clay did. He ordered a halt to all military trains into West Berlin. In other words, the only way to supply the military garrison there was by air, which was called the Little Lift. The Soviets began to violate West Berlin with West Berlin airspace and would harass, or what the military would call buzz flights, in and out of West Berlin. There was one instance that needs to be mentioned. A Soviet Yak-3 fighter aircraft collided with a British Overseas Airway Corporation civilian airliner, killing the Soviet pilots. And also all 97 people aboard that civilian airliner crashed into East Germany. All this did was exacerbate the tensions among the four sectors, four occupation zones. The Soviets demanded that American military personnel inside East Germany, or Eastern Zone, withdraw, who maintained communication equipment, to leave, and thus preventing the use of navigation beacons to mark the air routes. The 20th of April, the Soviets demanded that all barges obtain clearance before entering the Soviet zone. Now this affected the British more than it did us. On June 20th of 1948, there was a meeting in London, England, with representatives from the Benelux countries, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, plus representatives from the non-Soviet occupation zones of Germany, let's say British, French, and American, to decide the future of Germany. It was decided here that the best way to unify the country would be with a common currency, the Deutsche Mark, as you've seen that passed out here. The Soviets were not invited to this conference. And when the representatives got back to Germany at any rate, and they met, they wanted to know why, and they wouldn't be told, so they simply got and walked out, which also didn't help the situation any. June 21st is when the Deutsche Mark was introduced into the country itself, which the Soviets flatly refused to use. So the 22nd, they introduced the East German Mark, which you've also seen what that looks like. They also halted all passenger trains and traffic on that date to the Autobahn to Berlin. They delayed Western and German freight shipments into the city. They required that all water transport secure special Soviet permission, but this affected the British more than it did us. Now it really started to get serious here. The Soviets cut land and water connection between the non-Soviet zones in Berlin. It halted all rail and barge traffic in and out of Berlin and the West, as a counter proposal here, introduced a counter blockade, stopping all rail traffic into East Germany from the British and the US zones. The 25th, the Soviets stopped supplying food to the civilian population of Berlin. They cut off electricity relied on by Berlin, using their control over the generating plants in the eastern sector. But the West Berlin also had its own generating plant, but it had to be enlarged to take up the shortfall. Motor traffic was permitted from Berlin to the Western Zone, but this required a 23-kilometer or 14-mile detour to a ferry crossing because of alleged repairs to a bridge. Typical Soviet tactics. Now let's take a look at the military situation at this time. At the time of the Berlin Blockade, there were 8,973 troops stationed there. The British had 7,606, the French 6,100. In West Germany, there were 98,000 troops stationed there, of which 31,000 were combat troops. Now look at this, the Russians had 1,500,000 troops stationed in East Germany. It must be remembered that after World War II, the United States drastically reduced the size of its armed forces. The Russians didn't do that. And at the time of this situation developed, we had only one division inside the United States that could be sent to Europe to fight the Russians had that been the case. But General Clay was of the opinion that the Russians did not really want war, so they could have done whatever they wanted to do. They could have invested Berlin, forced a complete surrender of all the forces there from the western sectors, and the like. And if they wanted to, they could have probably gone all the way to the English Channel, because there was nothing there to stop them. The Western European countries were based pretty much the same way as Russia were with the ravages of World War II. There was nothing there. France was virtually destroyed because of the fight that took place there. And also the bombing and all of that went on. But anyway, this is what happened and the like. I must also say that this time the Russians had the Western Allies exactly where they wanted them. the city of Berlin itself was completely blockaded by land. There was no way else to supply except by air. Now let's take a look at what it would take to supply a city the size of Berlin with what it took for it to live on a daily basis. Now this is not what we sent. This was through the interzonal staff conferencing and consultations. What was decided was to be sent by the British or the Americans was worked out with these conferences. So it was decided which zone would send how much and what to Berlin and the like. But look at what it took to supply enough food and supplies to provide a minimum daily ration of 1,990 kilocalories per day per person inside Berlin. 646 tons of flour and wheat, 125 tons of cereal, 64 tons of fat, 109 tons of fish and meat, 180 tons of potatoes, 180 tons of sugar, 11 tons of coffee, 19 tons of powdered milk, 5 tons of whole milk for children, 3 tons of yeast for baking, 144 tons of dehydrated vegetables, 38 tons of salt, and 10 tons of cheese, for a total of 1,534 tons per day required to feed a city of 2 million people. Plus 3,475 tons of coal, diesel, and gasoline were needed for heat and power. That's a total of 5,000 tons per day needed to keep the city going. Imagine what that was. That's a formidable task. Anyway, so let's take a look at the aircraft. I won't go into a lot of this because we'd be here all day, because there was a large number of different aircraft used to send all these supplies into Berlin. But I'll talk about 4, 2 American, 2 British. The C-54 Skymaster, as you can see, has a tricycle landing gear that affords a level loading deck. This could carry 10 tons of supplies. The ground crews, as they gained experience, could load this plane with 10 tons of supplies within 6 minutes. The C-47 Skytrain, as you can see, had a sloped deck which made it more difficult to load. It could carry 3 tons of supplies. And they carried mainly food, fuel, and medical supplies. These aircraft, there were 109 of them used in this operation, and they were slowly replaced by aircraft that could carry more tons of supplies into Berlin. The British used the Avro Lancaster bomber, which was used during World War II. It could carry 7 tons of fuel into the city itself. Then there's a short Sunderland flying boat, which was specifically designed with a stainless steel hull that could resist rust and corrosion, that could carry salt into the city. They could carry 8 tons of salt with no problem to Berlin. Now, once it was decided that the only way to supply Berlin was what it needed to keep going, General LeMay appointed Lieutenant General shown here, but at the time he was a 1-star brigadier general at the time of the airlift, appointed him to organize the airlift itself, because he was General LeMay's chief of staff during the war in the Pacific as commander-in-chief of 21st Bomber Command that carried out the war against the Japanese, the air war against the Japanese. Anyway, he had great organizational skills, but he had no airlift experience. Anyway, when he's given charge of it, now, here we go again. Go back to that. Yeah, that's what you see. By the time we got involved in the operation, the British already had their airlift going. It's called Operation Plainfare. They operate from, of course, the northern sector and the American the southern. However, when we got involved, we had to work out a situation where it would facilitate an easier entry of the airplanes into Berlin as well as an exit. So it was agreed interzonally that the United States would fly into the south, the British in the north, and then exit through the central corridor. Now, any civilian aircraft that were flying in here into Berlin had to come into the central corridor, and it had to be scheduled to do that. It couldn't just walk in, just fly in when it wanted to, because all of this thing was completely coordinated. Now, when General Smith got control of this, he ordered all the aircraft he could get his hands on from around the world that had airlift capability, brought to West Germany to take part in this operation. And when, as they arrived, he required that each aircraft come with 3 crews. Each crew to operate 8 hours. On a 24-hour day, each crew would be rotated 8 hours on, 16 hours off to keep the crews as fresh as possible. He also had to set up a complex system of flying to Berlin, because he couldn't just simply take off. He had to reduce the possibility of accidents. So once this was done, the aircraft taking off by schedule would fly on a radio beam into the corridor. Then once into the corridor, would be vectored into the city of Berlin by ground controllers stationed inside Berlin. He also required that each group of aircraft flying into the corridor fly 1,000 feet higher than the other in a ladder or stack situation to facilitate an easier entry to the corridor itself and reduce the possibility of accidents or collisions. It was at the time that General Smith took command of this or set it up, it was believed that the aircraft operation itself would last no more than 3 weeks. But after 3 weeks, it became clear that it's going to have to last indefinitely. And so there was more pressure to get more aircraft involved and to streamline the operation. That's when this man was ordered into the city itself, in order to Germany to streamline the operations. Lieutenant General William Henry the Whip Tunner. Now, this is the man who had the airlift experience. He had organized the airlift operation from India, flying over the Himalayas into China to supply Chiang Kai-shek with needed supplies to fight the Japanese. This was the man to do it. At any rate, when he got into Germany, the first thing he did was try to get control of the entire operation. By going through channels with LeMay, getting in touch with General Clay, with Field Marshal Sir Bernard Montgomery of the British sector, and Air Vice Marshal Donald Bennett, that controlled the British operation, the airlift operation. They agreed that he could take over the entire operation itself. And he favored a more direct, straight-in approach. What he wanted done here was to have aircraft fly no more than 300 feet apart, landing every 30 to 45 seconds inside Berlin. And the aircraft flying in there had only one chance to land. If they could not land, they'd turn back around until they go to that central corridor, back at a later date, later time, to go back to participate in the airlift. He also required that the air crew, once on the ground, stay inside the aircraft. They could not leave. Once on the ground, the engine shut down, the unloading began. Each aircraft was approached by 3 jeeps. One carrying personnel to inspect the airplane, another jeep to brief the pilot and air crew on weather conditions or any other information necessary to fly back to Western Germany. And another one to bring refreshments, as say food and drink to the air crew, which was served by pretty German Feuerlines, and one who knew they could not be asked out. And one pilot said they were very friendly as a result. So, anyway, that's how it went. Now let's take a look at what it looked like itself. I'll talk more about how this thing got developed, how it got going, but one thing about this, you see here the arrival of aircraft flying into Temple Hall. It's a C-54 coming into the city itself. C-47's on the ground being unloaded. As you see here at Temple Hall Airport, unloading of milk. That's coal in those bags. The C-54 transport, as well as flour. Berlin's watching flour being unloaded from the C-54 itself. One problem that was faced with General Tunner at this time he got it going was the onset of winter. The problem was not bad weather so much as a dense, heavy fog that lasted several weeks, many weeks. And it was necessary to fly as many supplies to Berlin as possible because flying would be curtailed because of bad weather. Well, one group of 42 planes took off at one time to fly there. Only one could land, so they had to turn around and go back. And this was basically the situation up until about the end of January 49, when the weather began to clear up, as you'll see. I was talking a little bit about Operation Little Vittles, which was started here by Lieutenant Gale Halverson. He had a hobby of wanting to make movies with his camera, so he would fly in his off hours, fly as a passenger on these planes to land in Berlin, and then take movies of whatever he could take movies of. But anyway, he noticed a bunch of kids staying at the end of a runway where he was not very far from. He went over and talked to them, and they were curious about the plane he flew and the planes that were flying into the airport, which he gladly told them all about. And then he had 2 sticks of Wrigley's Double Mint chewing gum on his person, so he gave them to those kids. They took the wrappers off and pieced it out hands as many of those kids as they could, and those that did not get any of the chewing gum, they passed the wrappers around so they could smell the inside so they know what it would taste like. Anyway, he was so taken by their generosity and their gratitude toward him, and the fact they didn't fight over this, that he said, well, when I come back tomorrow, I'll drop candy bars attached to a parachute and the like. And they asked, well, how do we know it's you? He said, well, I'll wiggle my wings. Well, that's what he did. Well, anyway, he kept doing this. Every time he flew, he would do that. He noticed each time he did, the crowds got bigger. Well, it got to the point that it made the news. He also started getting mail at his base operations. Letters addressed to Uncle Wiggly Wings, Chocolate Uncle, Chocolate Flyer. Oh, I guess the thing. I guess it. Uh-oh. Well, anyway.
Yeah, I usually have my laptop with
But
me.
you can do that.
No, I don't, I didn't bring it
Okay.
today.
Well, yeah, I can continue, I think, a little bit of this. Anyway, it got to be, no, it made the news over there. You can imagine that Lieutenant Halverson's commanding officer did not like what was going on, because he thought it was a distraction from the mission. If you're in the military, you know the mission's everything. At any rate, General Tunner got wind of what was going on. He wanted it continued, because he thought it would be a good public relations effort, as well as a morale booster. So it was allowed to continue. The other units started getting involved in this, and continued to drop candy bars attached to parachutes, not just handkerchiefs, but parachutes, and the likes. It also made the news in the United States at the time, and by then, every candy manufacturing company in this country began to send boatloads of chocolate candy bars over to Europe, and were used in this operation. So by the end of the operation itself, into the Berlin area, over 3 tons of chocolate candy bars have been dropped on Berlin. Now you might ask what the Russians thought about all of this. They didn't like it for sure. There are 773 recorded incidents of Soviet harassment. That translates into 2 incidents per day, every day for 14 months. Some more, some less, depending on what the weather was like. But here's what the Russians did. They shone searchlights onto the aircraft, particularly at night, in the face of the pilots to blind them. They also fired anti-aircraft guns outside the corridor boundaries to fray the nerves and distract the pilots. They used air-to-air firing of rockets, or setting off explosions on the ground or outside the corridor boundaries, which could be seen and heard. They also resumed the buzz flights, often flying as close as 20 feet over the aircraft, or shining their landing lights on the faces of pilots to blind them. One American pilot got so mad about this, he'd been buzzed 3 times before, so he saw an aircraft flying toward us at night, and so he positioned his plane toward that plane and turned his own landing lights to force that pilot to veer off. That's one thing that happened. So anyway, I want to go into tonnages. That's the next thing.
register for the draft. A lot of history there. My uncle was in the Air Force down here in the 50s. I had 2 uncles in World War II, one got caught in the Battle of Bulge, another one in the Air Force. My grandfather got drafted in World War I. He said he was born in a train, he blew the whistle, the war was over, so he didn't have to go. He was born in 1896. My sister did 20 years in the Navy. And
I
my
can't
sister was
continue
in the Air
using my
Force.
own phone here. Here's some idea about the tonnages that showed how the airlift itself developed. On 25th of June 1948, when the operation began, since there weren't that many airplanes available at the time, only 80 tons were delivered to Berlin the first day. The first week, 90 tons per day were delivered to Berlin. And the second week, 1,000 tons per day were developed and delivered into Berlin. After August of 1948, when General Tunner got involved, 4,500 tons per day were delivered to Berlin. So you can see it started going really well here. But after that, the winter, there was very little flying into Berlin itself. But after January of 1949, a target of 5,000 tons per day were delivered into Berlin. Most tons delivered in a single day was 12,941 tons and 1,383 flights. Eventually, as much as 6,729 to 8,393 tons per day were delivered into Berlin. Once it got going, it looked like a well-oiled machine after February of 1949. After a prolongation of the airlift, it became clear to Stalin that the airlift could continue indefinitely after 14 months. And by May of 1949, the airlift and blockade had become an embarrassment to the Russians. So they agreed to lift the travel restrictions in May of 1949, and 1 minute past midnight on May 12th, the Russian blockade was ended, and with the result that there was public rejoicing and dancing in the streets in Berlin at its conclusion, or its cessation. However, the airlift, as I mentioned earlier, continued until September 30th of 1949 to ensure that the Berliners would have enough supplies should the Russians reimpose that blockade. Now, the Russians tried this also under President Eisenhower in 1958 and got the same response they got back here in 1949. And they also tried under President Kennedy, if you remember back then. But by then, we were going to mobilize or call up the reserves at the time. But the Russians were forced to back down. Anyway, that's under President Kennedy. Now, I'd like to say a little bit about General Lucius D. Clay. He had declared his intention to retire from the U.S. Army on May 3rd of 1949. His office was in Frankfurt am Main, and at his retirement ceremony, there were 11,000 American troops there that gave him the salute. At the same time, aircraft information flew over lasting several minutes to also show their appreciation for what this man had done to hold the line against the Russians. Once he got back to the United States, he was given a ticker tape parade down 5th Avenue in New York City, an event that's usually reserved for VIPs, people who have done extraordinary things for the United States of America. He was also invited to address a joint session of Congress, which he did, and President Truman awarded him personally a Distinguished Service Medal in recognition of his services at this time for the United States, and one of 3 that he had been awarded in his service career. His actions reflected the highest traditions and standards of the U.S. Army at that time. Now, some of the statistics that resulted from this airlift. There was 1,783,573 tons of supplies delivered by the U.S. Air Force into Berlin at this time. 76.6% of the total tonnage sent to Berlin was sent by American aircraft. The Royal Air Force supplied 541,943 tons, or 26.3% of the tonnage is sent into Berlin, for a total of 2,236,406 tons of supplies during this 14-month operation to supply Berlin. The total number of flights amounted to 278,228 flights, for a total distance of 92 million miles. That's more or less from one-way trip from the Earth to the Sun. A total of 130,000 people were evacuated from Berlin at this time, mainly children, the elderly, and the sick. The children were sent to friends and relatives inside West Germany. The elderly, where possible, to the same. And where not, as well as sick, were sent to institutions where they could be cared for. The cost of the operation was $224 million, or $270 million, or $2,270 million, or $5,070 million in 2023 dollars. The record number of flights by one crew into Berlin was 404, held by a British crew flew from Brunstorf outside Hamburg into Berlin 404 times. No military crew or civilian crew matched the record, could come close to a record like that. Now the casualties resulting from this airlift, and there were casualties, and particularly crashes. There were 37 crashes of aircraft involved in taking off and landing, and there were 101 fatalities, 31 American, 39 British, and 8 German, a miscellaneous of 23, for a total of 101 casualties. Sorry I don't have the photograph of the monument site by itself, but it's a three-pronged deal with going toward the ground, indicate the air corridors. But also engraved in this site of this memorial are the great names of the people who directly lost their life because of this airlift. Now, what the airlift accomplished. The blockade failed to convince the West Berliners to reject their Western allies, which was a byproduct of what Stalin was wanting to do. But during this time, the West Berliners were subjected to a constant propaganda campaign to help force the Western allies out of Berlin, not just what the Russians were going to do, but get the West Berlin, the East Berliners, or West Berliners to also reject their own occupiers. The blockade also aided in the creation of a unified West Germany. The blockade led to the creation of NATO in 1955, and the alliance that still exists to this day. The blockade made the Soviet Union look like a cruel enemy to the rest of the world. They didn't care. They don't even care now. The airlift transformed Berlin into a symbol of democracy and freedom. Now, the lessons learned from this operation: it unified the powers, the Western powers, Allied powers against the Soviet Union. The Allies resolved to stay inside Germany rather than withdraw in 1949, as was planned, but to stay there as long as Russia posed a threat to the country as well as to the stability of Western Europe, which did not end until 1994 with actually 1990 with the fall of the wall, as you've seen part of that look like. But also in 1994 with the dissolution of the Allied Control Council that controlled Berlin itself was dissolved, and therefore Berlin as well as Germany could govern itself from that point on. The airlift showed the benefits of promoting humanitarian aid abroad. It was a symbol of service before self. The airlift demonstrated the value of efficiency and innovation. The challenges faced during the Berlin airlift are similar to the challenges faced today under similar circumstances, and this has happened since that time. The airlift laid the groundwork for humanitarian airlift missions today, and the airlift showed the importance of perseverance and compassion. Now, what if the airlift had failed? Can't imagine it not having failed, but what if it had? For one thing, it would have been a tremendous propaganda victory for the Soviet Union. At the same time, the prestige of Western allies, particularly the United States, would have suffered severely, requiring years, if not decades, to recover from it. The failure would have meant a humanitarian crisis for the citizens of Berlin, resulting in the deaths and the starvation of thousands of people living in Berlin itself. The Western allies would have probably had to give up Berlin. But barring that, the only other option was to take direct military action against the Soviets to save the city, resulting in a direct military confrontation with the Soviets, leading to war, which Stalin knew he could not win because he didn't have nuclear weapons. He knew we did. We used them during World War II, dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. At the time of this airlift operation, we had 50 that could be used against them. And we were prepared to use them. A lot of people don't realize that back then that President Truman had authorized the use or sending of 3 groups of B-29 bombers to Western Europe just for this eventuality, armed with those bombs. That's 135 aircraft. Not all of them would have carried bombs, but they'd been there for any other use that had been necessary. Anyway, Stalin knew that we could wipe him off the face of the earth if it came down to that, and there was nothing he could do about it. Anyway, I'd like to conclude my presentation with a personal experience I had there in 1973. I went to visit my German roommate at Austin College in Sherman. He was a teacher there. He's since passed on. He's a special education teacher there in a small town in North Germany. And I went to visit him and stay with him and the family for 6 weeks while I was there in 1973. It wasn't long there before he invited me to go to a party, festival or something like that in the town. I don't know where it was even then. I don't know where it was now. If I didn't, I've forgotten. But I'll never forget what happened when I got into there. Walked there with my friend, and just standing there doing nothing for a while. And there was a big party going on there, as you can well imagine, that type of thing. All of a sudden, a man comes up to me. I don't know how he knew I was American. Just because I was different from everybody else that you used to see. Most Germans are very curious people. Comes up to me and puts his hands around my face like this. Gets in my face and says to me, "Thank God for you Americans. If it were not for you, Germany would be broken." He said that to me in German, but I knew what he was saying. That told me then, as it tells me now, that those Germans still appreciate what we did for them post-World War II. And I've had people tell me then, as I've traveled over there many times, and told me how grateful they were for the Marshall Plan. But not only that, but the people of West Berlin still appreciate what we did for them to this day. Those kids back then, they were able to get their hands on these candy bars attached to parachutes, still have those parachutes inside their homes as remembrance of what it was like back then. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer the best I possibly can. Yes, sir.
My question is, if we had all that equipment, we're the best in the world after in World War II, why did we allow that?
Because we had reduced our military so much. You have no idea how far and how fast we reduced the size of our armed forces. All the thing we could do was simply supply what we had around the world where we were stationed, but there were not that many. Frankly, the airlift capacity we used in this airlift operation represented 40 to 50% what we had available, and still maintain our presence around the world.
You know, the cost of the Berlin, the airlift, the food and all that, as opposed to the war, wouldn't that be kind of?
Well, it wasn't the same the same necessity it was during World War II itself as opposed to war itself. This is not a wartime situation, but it was semi that way. It required dedication, required commitment, but we can only do so much by what we had, and the British also had the best of what they could do, and so for the French did virtually nothing.
But I'm still trying to figure out, like you said, we haven't won a war since World War II.
Well, that's because, we never really declared war by Congress since then. We get right down to it. Korean War was basically a conflict, but it was never really a declared war. And as well as Vietnam, the same thing, as well as what went on in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's not a declared situation. When it goes through Congress for declared war, it means you go after the jugular vein for the enemy. You want to destroy them completely. And that's not what we wanted to do in those various conflicts. We said we wanted to hold the line, if you will, against the Soviets or whatever it was that we were trying to do. And not really get to a point where public opinion could affect the outcome. That's what I think. I agree with what you're saying.
I still think after World War I, too, I know why people didn't want to go back to war, but I think if we could have got into that World War II sooner, we could have saved a lot of lives.
That's a totally different situation. And of course, back then, Congress had its mind on simply trying to save money and not trying to do anything, trying to build up military until it became necessary about 1938-39, when it became clear that we were going to have to get involved in World War II.
I think they knew deep down we had to go in.
Well,
we just waited for an excuse.
Well, perhaps, yeah. There's several different viewpoints about that, to say the least. Some say that Franklin Roosevelt wanted us to get into the war through the back door by simply letting Pearl Harbor happen. But that's
I
not
sometimes wonder that too, because I was over in Pearl Harbor and I seen where they came through.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And they warned us. So to me,
I know. Even Billy Mitchell predicted that the
there's
Japanese
still
would attack Pearl Harbor.
cement cracked at Fort Island
Yeah.
where the bombs hit.
Yeah.
They never even fixed it.
I'm aware of that. Interesting. Anything else? Please ask. Yes. Yes.
One thing that struck me at the beginning of your presentation, when you were talking about Stalin and his grand plan,
Oh, absolutely.
seems to me today all you have to do is substitute the word Putin.
Well, Stalin was paranoid. I mean, you have no idea how many people have died because of that man's, during his reign. He took power in 1928 and he started eliminating his enemies, or what he thought were friends, were enemies. And that just meant whole groups of people. This idea of purging someone, not just getting rid of enemies that he perceives as enemies, but their friends, their relatives, anybody associated with them. It's like taking out by the root. In other words, exterminating the entire people that he may have been associated with. That's where it all came up. That's how that came about. The best way to understand how Stalin's number of people Stalin killed is look at the population census figures. They'll give you some idea of what how it went from one to the other, basically downward. get somebody, how many people that man had killed. Had he lived, it was looking, I understand that he was, it may have led to another purge, but maybe as many as 9 million people would have died.
Yeah.
Either through starvation, to the gulag, or taken out and shot. And he had no problem with that.
So you were saying they tried it again in '63 on Kennedy. Was that part of
They
the
did the
Cuban
same
Missile
thing, by trying
Crisis?
to cut off the supplies, the generating plants, the electricity, that type of thing.
As part of the Cuban Missile Crisis?
No, this was in addition to it.
Oh.
But they got the same response, and therefore that's under Nikita Khrushchev at the time, was one of Stalin's buddies, if you want to look at it that way.
So where in the world, when you've got this much aviation flying, and it's all piston prop engines, where in the world did they get the volume of high octane aviation fuel right after World War II? I would think all the
It was
refineries.
shipped in, it had to be shipped in, there's no way to do it.
From the United
Germany.
States or from
Yeah.
England or?
Well, the United States primarily, it was shipped in, if not flown in.
So logistics tailed all the way from the United States to Europe
Yeah.
for aviation gas?
Pretty much, yeah. I also think about it, we also had stocks there as a result of World War II, the fuel dumps that we had there as well, that stayed there.
So we didn't try to retrograde that material back. Most of the logistics
No,
tail
I
was
think
still there.
they kept that there for operational purposes.
What was that central city? They flew in from the north and from Rhine-Main in the south. What was I couldn't read on the map, the city that the air channel flying out went into in Germany.
Oh, you're talking about the central corridor, that was, from,
Celle or what was it?
I think that was probably I would think from Taylor. Well, that's a good question. I would think that they would take them and fly back around through there. I would think that there was no way that either the British or the American or even the French could fly directly to that. They had to fly, or I want to say, take off and fly into that corridor itself. There's no way they could fly into it directly from another point inside Berlin into that. That wasn't possible. And take off and fly around, then fly in that way, as long as it was within Berlin airspace.
Must have been a heck of a maintenance
Well,
situation.
that's correct. The way that worked with the maintenance is that you bought that. I didn't mention that here, but the planes were inspected every 20 hours. When it came to 100 hours, they were given a complete inspection. I mean, top to bottom. After 1,000 hours, those planes were flown back to the United States and then given a complete overhaul before they were sent back to Europe. It was a monumental operation.
So when they were flying in, they had radio beacons to be able to
Fly into the corridor, and once in the corridor, they were vectored into the city by ground controllers inside Berlin.
Oh, that'd be pretty tough when it was thick fog.
Particularly, or even at night.
I mean, even visual flight rules.
Yeah.
I mean, if you can't
Yeah.
see. I mean,
Well, the thing about General Tunney, once he got involved, crashes, incidents of accidents went down where the efficiency went up. And it
Did the
caused big
Russians,
experience.
when there was a crash in the East German zone, did the Russians mess with our people when we tried to do crash recovery?
No, this occurred, now the only instance I'm aware of is that civilian airliner. I don't know what was done with what happened there, I have no idea, maybe that worked out between the Russians and the British, I don't know. But, to my knowledge, there were no crashes inside East Germany over to this airlift. The Russians tried to disrupt it or to cause maybe something to crash, but that didn't happen. It only happened to take off and landing inside, either take off inside West Germany or landing inside Berlin.
Was there any industry, going on, or was this just a free gratis welfare deal where we pay for it and you show up and eat the flour and use the coal?
Okay.
Was there
You're
any
talking about-
industry?
Okay, you're asking basically if the British had to pay for what we done? No. This was funded strictly by the United States and Great Britain itself.
Was there any industry going on in West Berlin then, or?
Well, I don't know about that so much, I really don't know much about it. I'm sure there was, but think about this time. Berlin was bombed 262 times during World War II. And it was flat. I mean, I've been there and I've seen what the repaired buildings where you can see that where the war damage was. All I did was simply patch over that. You can see that to this day. So, as far as that's concerned, I don't know that there was that much going on at the time. But again, 3 years after the war, something had to be going on.